the card is too small for you to actually make a paper. I'm sure someone probably could, but I can't. I don't have fingernails. That ain't going to work. So, yeah. Just so you know, I'm terrible at making paper airplanes to begin with. It never really worked out for me. So, oh well. We actually have, and the reason why I wanted to come up and explain this to you personally, we have a huge urgent ministry opportunity. Some of you have received the email and the letter that we put out this last week. Some of you have not heard. In your bulletin, you have a list of supplies. You ask, what are those for? Well, right now we've all heard about what has happened down in Puerto Rico. That Hurricane Maria came through and absolutely devastated the area. There is actually a church that we have worked with before in the past to provide them with computers. They have a school attached to their church that is on a remote part of the island. And because they are on a remote part of the island, about 3 hours away from the nearest town, they will be on the last of the list to get aid from FEMA. And so it could be weeks, if not months, before they get any kind of aid from FEMA at this point. They have reached out to us and to others, and we've reached out to other churches to start figuring out how to get basic supplies, basic needs, basic toiletries down to them so that they are able to still function. But it's a little bit interesting because right now we have to work with the church in Dallas to even get those supplies to them. Because shipping lines right now are so messed up, it's kind of tricky to even get things down there to begin with. There's a church in Dallas that actually has ties to a shipping company that is reliable in Puerto Rico right now, that they have guaranteed that the supplies will get there. The problem is it's going to cost them from Dallas to Puerto Rico to ship a 53-foot container to them. It's going to cost them about $9,000. So if you can only imagine how much it would cost us to send stuff down to Puerto Rico. So what we're doing is we're coordinating with Dallas. They are shipping out their container, I think they said the 25th of October, but that puts us on a time crunch. We have to ship out by this Thursday morning, or the aid will not get to Dallas in time to be able to ship over to Puerto Rico to begin with. So in your bulletin, there is a list of things that are needed. We need supplies, aid to be able to send over to this church in need, to our brothers and sisters in need, and we are needing those supplies by Wednesday. So if God has put it on your heart, if you feel so led, this is a good opportunity to help firsthand our brothers and sisters who are in need, who have been devastated by this natural disaster. And this aid will be very appreciated, very needed for them to be able to continue doing the ministry and the work that God has put before them. So, with that in mind, pray, give, and I would encourage you to, sometime before Wednesday, to help contribute to this church in need. So, with that, today we are going to talk a little bit about miracles. And before you say anything, no, Pastor hasn't gone off the deep end a little bit, but we're going to talk today about miracles. Go with me to Luke chapter 9, starting in verse 10. We spoke a little bit about 10 last week, but we're actually going to go back through 10 because it's important to note what actually has just happened in the last passage. When the apostles returned, they reported to Jesus all that they had done. He took them along and withdrew privately to a town called Bethsaida. When the crowds found out, they followed him. He welcomed them, spoke to them about the kingdom of God, and cured those who needed healing. Late in the day, the 12 approached and said to him, "Send the crowd away so that they can go to the surrounding villages and countryside to find food and lodging, because we are in a deserted place here." "You give them something to eat," he said. "We have no more than 5 loaves and 2 fish, they said, "unless we go and buy food for all these people," for about 5,000 men were there. Then he told his disciples, "Have them sit down in groups of about 50 each." They did so, and had them all sit down. Then he took the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, And looking up to heaven, he blessed them and broke them. He kept giving them to the disciples to set before the crowd. Everyone ate and was filled. Then they picked up 12 baskets of leftover pieces. So the apostles had returned after going out and spreading the word of Jesus. We remember last week we talked about how they had gone out. Jesus had sent them out to go and spread the word of the kingdom and gave them the authority and the ability to do miracles. And so they had done that even when they were not necessarily welcomed in some places. They had come back even under the threat of persecution. We saw last week from Herod and from others who did not like the fact that Jesus and his disciples were going around taking news of the kingdom because they saw that as a threat to their power. But even under that persecution, and even though they might lack provision, which we'll talk about here in a minute because that's important, they still went out and spread the word of Jesus. They went out to spread the word of Jesus, and they accomplished that. What is more, God took care of them. They had the provisions they needed. They had what they needed. We remember that Jesus told them, go out, but don't take anything with you. Trust that God is going to provide for your needs. Remember that as we look at this passage today, because we tend to look at this story right here, and we go, Jesus fed the 5,000. Yay! And that's kind of the children's church edition right there. And we miss something key in this passage. We miss something very key because the main point of this passage right here, this miracle, is not for the 5,000. Think about this for a second as we go through this today. These disciples did what Jesus gave them the authority to do. They had done miracles. They had the ability and the authority because they were showing who they were from. The miracle validated their message. And so they had the ability to do miracles for a reason, for a specific purpose that God had sent them out to go and accomplish. Now, through that, they were welcomed in some places. They gave their message. They showed the miracles as validation of the message. They were welcomed in some places. People loved the disciples. The disciples had left Jesus without any provisions because Jesus told them, don't go out with any provisions, but go into houses that will welcome you. God put these houses in place, these people in place to welcome the disciples in so that they would have provision. God provided for his representatives through these people. There were some villagers that did not welcome the apostles. They didn't welcome the apostles at all because they did not want the disciples, the apostles, there to begin with. They didn't want to hear about Jesus. But even through that, God still provided for them. And we see that because they all came back. None of them starved to death. None of them lacked anything. They all came back to Jesus and reported to him what had happened. They came back to tell Jesus of what they'd done. They came back. If things had gone wrong, why would they have come back? They probably wouldn't have come back at all. But instead, we see through that them coming back that they were provided for. That the villagers, some of them did take care of them. And even when some of them didn't, they were always provided for. And they came back to tell Jesus all that they had done and all that had happened to them. It says in the next text here that the disciples then go to a place called Bethsaida. Now, it's interesting that they say Bethsaida because if we remember our geography here, where did Jesus sent them out from around Tiberias? Bethsaida is around Capernaum, which is on the opposite side of the Sea of Galilee. So we see Jesus, we've gone from around Tiberias, around this side of the Sea of Galilee, the west side, and he travels with the disciples across the boat, with the storm. They go across the sea, heal the demoniac, go back, do some more ministry here. He sends them out, and then they come back to Tiberias and then walk themselves around back to the other side, back to Bethsaida, which is a little bit north of Capernaum. So they've actually gone back to the opposite side of the Sea of Galilee. And a large crowd recognizes the disciples. But this time, a very different reaction than what they had before. Because we remember Bethsaida is actually pretty close by to where Jesus healed the demoniac. And what happened then? The people from that town told him, please what? Please leave. Now he's back in the same area, and what do the people do? They welcome him in. They've heard. They've heard about all that Jesus has been doing. And so now, this crowd, we see a very different reaction than what had happened before. This crowd said it was numbered 5,000 men. Now, we always kind of hook our story around 5,000 men. This might mean 5,000 teachers or 5,000 people went to hear Jesus teach. 5,000 men does not include their families, possibly, their children, or any other relatives. We remember, in a lot of times in Jewish culture, it's only the men that are mentioned because of how the culture viewed women and children during that time. The men were counted, but not necessarily the women and the children. So there could actually be more than 5,000 people at this event. That is a strong possibility. But what's important is that this massive crowd had found out about Jesus. A massive crowd had come to hear him teach. Now, what's Jesus usually do when this massive crowd comes along and tries to find him to hear him teach? What has he usually done before? Usually, Jesus, when he sees a big crowd coming towards him, he retreats. He goes off. Why? Because it was not his time yet. And usually the crowds would come to basically press him into service of being their king. And it wasn't Jesus' time yet. But now we see he sent out the disciples. People know the kingdom of God is at hand. And so Jesus welcomes them. He wants to teach them about the kingdom. The message is spread. The news about Jesus has spread. Jesus and the people know what he's claiming. And so Jesus welcomes them and begins to teach them about what the kingdom is offering. And we see through a lot of the teaching about the kingdom of God, what he's teaching is a merciful and gracious kingdom. This loving kingdom that has offered hope to these people. And that's the one thing these people latch onto. Hope. Hope. And Jesus proves this by doing what he's been doing the entire time. He heals these people. Once again, the miracle validates the message. He's offering a kingdom of hope. And what does he offer these people as validation? He cures them of their diseases, giving them hope. The miracle validates the message. The kingdom is a kingdom of hope, and here's the proof right here as he heals these people. But while he was teaching, it starts getting late in the day. And what's late in the day? I come home from work, and every once in a while I come home, my wife is gracious enough to say, hey, what do you want for dinner? Sometimes I cook, sometimes she cooks, but it gets late in the day. What do you want? It's time to eat. It's time for dinner. And that's what these disciples are thinking. It is time to get some food. And that's what these people are thinking as well. This massive crowd of people. The day had gone long. These people were getting hungry. The disciples knew that these people were getting hungry and knew that they couldn't stay out there forever. So they went to go talk to Jesus. See if the people could be sent away so that they could have food and lodging for the night. They told Jesus that these people needed to be sent away to get food for the rest of the night. They couldn't stick around because the disciples did not think it was possible for them to be taken care of there. Now stop for a second. The disciples did not think that these people could be provided for right in front of Jesus. Keep that thought in your head while we go through this story right here. There was not enough food for them. The disciples probably only had enough for themselves since they most likely thought it was only going to be them going out to Bethsaida anyway. This crowd came out of nowhere. They didn't expect a crowd of this size, and must have believed that there was no way that they could help support a crowd of this size. The only chance they thought that these people had was if they went out to get food on their own. These people needed to eat. They needed to get rest. They couldn't just stand out there in the middle of nowhere. And to the disciples, this is a problem that needs a solution. The time of teaching had to be over because the people could not be kept there long term. They needed to go somewhere. Luckily, the disciples knew of villages and towns nearby where people could go and get food. This is why it's important to note that this happened around the town of Bethsaida. There were towns and villages around the area. Towns and villages that could support these people where they could go and get food, go and get lodging. The Sea of Galilee had many different towns, some of which we have seen thus far, where people could be accommodated. These were also places where they could find rest. And the disciples were actually thinking about these people's safety and their needs. And so we need to see the disciples, they have great intentions. They want to see these people fed and taken care of and safe. And so they figure the best solution they have is to send these people away into the towns, because the disciples knew the place they were in was deserted, and they don't have enough food for all of them. A large group like that was just too many that they thought. There was no way they could take care of all of them. There were 5,000 of them. So they went and told Jesus that he needed to let them go into the next town. You need to send these people away because we don't have the provision to be able to take care of these people. How strange it must have been for Jesus to hear this coming from his disciples' mouth. Did they still really lack in faith that much? After all that had happened, after all they had been through, did they still really not have complete trust in him? There has to be some perplexion in Jesus' eyes for a minute, because these guys, his guys, still don't get it. And when we realize why, we'll see this is a problem too. Because the first thought a lot of us might have is, of course, the disciples are doing the right thing. Why wouldn't you sit there and you have very little to go around to begin with? What's the solution? Well, just send them to the towns, and then they can go get food and lodging. That seems like a logical, right way to do things. They want the people to eat. They want the people to rest and be safe. So why wouldn't they say it's time for all of them to head back in town? In any normal circumstance, this would be right. In any other circumstance, this would have been the right move. Except for one thing. This isn't any normal circumstance. Especially when you have the God of the universe in the flesh sitting right in front of them. Remember what they were sent out to do before. They were sent out to go and tell people about the kingdom of God. The kingdom of God is near. They were sent out to be representatives of Jesus. They had been sent out to show what Jesus had been doing. And they had seen all these things that Jesus had done. They were given the ability to do these things as well by Jesus. They knew of all the miraculous things that were happening around Jesus. And they knew that God would provide for his people because he had done it before. He had done it before with the disciples who had gone out to the countryside with nothing, and God provided. They had seen God's provision. They had done miracles, and yet here they are telling God incarnate that he has to send these people away because they do not believe they are capable of taking care of them. Now let me be clear on this. I do not mean that the disciples think in the mindset of anything close to this is a humility thing before God, and that the disciples don't think that they themselves on their own can take care of these people. That's not their thinking right here. These disciples completely forgot what has already happened thus far in their own lives and are completely missing it. which is a common occurrence with these disciples around the time. Again, I've mentioned before, with some of them, Peter especially, it seems like Jesus has to slap him upside the head every single passage because he does something else that, frankly, is dumb. Because they were provided for on more than one occasion by God on their travels. And now they think that God, who is actually sitting there right in front of them, is unable to take care of this group. And Jesus just tells them, you feed them. Go feed them. This is almost like Jesus looking over at the disciples and saying, are you guys kidding me? He tells the disciples to go feed them because they should be able to. They lack the faith to even try. Jesus tells them to feed this group because he wants them to see something here. Now, the disciples are right. In any other normal circumstance, they would have had